Good evening, students. Welcome back. And today we have lecture number 6 on research and publication ethics. Last lecture, we discussed some more cases of plagiarism. And then we also discussed what are redundant publications. And we had something about data misinterpretation, selective reporting. And so now today we move on to the next topic. And that would be, we also discussed ethical issues last time. And, what are these ethical committees? So far, what I had discussed was mainly something to do with the misconducts which happen during the course of the research work. So today we'll be talking about publication ethics. What are publication ethics, their importance, what are the guidelines available? And then one topic which I'll be taking up today is conflict of interest. So what do you mean by this publication ethics and why is it important? If you look at the research plan you would have followed as per the research methodologies which you would have adopted. So initially you would have made some plan for your research work. Then you move on to collecting and capturing data, recording of data, and all those things. Then after that, you may have to do some processing of the data. And then after that, you end up analyzing the data and bring it to the final result. So once the results are available with you, then the next logical step in this regard would be to disseminate this information that you have gained. I say disseminate because either you could be publishing the results in a journal, or you may even present the results in a conference in front of a peer group. So that is what I mean by saying dissemination of the results, which include both publication as well as presentation in a conference, any other such possible. So you come to the stage where you have to finally publish your results, for example, in a journal. So from this point, we'll go with the premise that you would like to publish the results in some scientific journal in your area of research. So then what are the steps you need to take? What are the problems you might face in this regard? So all those things we will now discuss from now on. So why should you be publishing your results? It's a natural consequence at the conclusion of any research problem, activity. You need to disseminate the knowledge gained in the form of a publication, in a journal, or a conference presentation. And why do you do this? Because most of us would say that you would like to get recognition for your work, maybe in the form of some awards, citations, or you may be interested in obtaining a tenure or a position, academic position, or you may already be a faculty member and you would be interested in getting a career promotion with the help of these publications. But this is only one part of the story. In fact, if you see the broader picture, there's an even more important requirement which is to be fulfilled. And that is to enlighten the peer groups in your area of research. When you enlighten your peer groups, your research will get validated by those who will be looking at your results and then trying to reproduce the experiments, or they may take it further in a different direction starting off from where you have left. So bringing your results to the attention of your peer groups is very much essential. Then, of course, if your research has been supported by some funding agencies, then publication is a natural consequence of the funding which you have obtained. And this is like an answer to the funding which you have obtained from a particular funding agency. And finally, you have the public to whom you owe this knowledge, because ultimately when research benefits, the public also will have trust in what you're doing and indirectly support you further. Then there could be knowledge gaps in your area of research which you're carrying out, and your results may actually help to fill those gaps in the research knowledge. And by doing so, they can identify what are the future thrust areas in your research area. Then also, if your research happens to be totally out of the box or a comprising path-breaking ideas, then this could even direct future research areas, and you may even get further recognition due to this reason. So when you want to publish and when you publish, there are certain ethics which need to be followed, not only on your part, they had to be followed even by the journal where you are going to hoping to publish your results. So the ethical standards for publication, they exist to ensure high quality scientific publications, to ensure public trust in the scientific findings, and to ensure that the right people receive credit for their ideas. So whenever a research work gets disseminated, either in form of a publication or in the form of a presentation before a peer group, it has to get validated by the concerned peer group, and this could have the potential to shape future research in that area or even contribute to societal benefit. So by looking at all these very important points, it becomes the responsibility of the scientist to follow ethical practices in the research cycle, the entire research cycle leading to the stage of publication. So what it implies is that in that entire research cycle, which I was showing you a while ago, in case you follow certain unethical practices, okay, then it can have far-reaching implications when you actually publish those kind of results which emanate from unethical practices. So, apart from your own responsibilities as a scientist, the various journals or the media for dissemination of scientific knowledge, they could be publishing houses which publish journals. There could be conferences which are held time to time in your area of research. So these people have their own responsibilities to follow ethical guidelines whenever they publish an author's research work or whenever they allow a person to present a research work in a certain conference. So an ethical and honest publication would go a long way in advancing scientific knowledge. It will bring in new developments and then reaffirm the public's faith in your research, as well as reaffirm the funding agency's trust in your research. And finally, as I said earlier, it can contribute to the society. So the matter of utmost importance here is that all the stakeholders in this sphere of human activity, that means the researchers, then the funding agencies, the institutions, as well as publishing houses, the entire gamut of entities which are involved in this activity, they follow ethical practices at all stages to ensure maximum benefit to all. But unfortunately, the reality is quite different. Everything is not hunky-dory. So this expectation that all stakeholders fully follow ethical practices is actually rather idealistic expectation. As we have seen in the course of earlier lectures, scientific misconduct as well as questionable research practices, they're fairly widespread. So it becomes all the more important that higher standards in publication ethics are maintained by journals and the publishers. Because in case there has been a scientific misconduct during the course of a research work and it has found itself in the form of a publication, then it becomes the responsibility of the journal or the publishing house to find out whether you have followed ethical practices and whether the manuscript that you have submitted is the result of following ethical practices or not. So the editors and publishers of journals, they must impose upon themselves the best practices and standards and follow certain mandatory guidelines. So how is this possible? Because in principle, editors may say that, look, I have received a manuscript from an author and my job is to check whether it is okay or not to be published in a journal. Why should you worry whether you have followed ethical standards or you have done some scientific misconduct? So it's a difficult situation for editors of journals. So till some years ago, this used to be dealt with on case-to-case basis without any generalized guidelines. So it was going on like that. But now there is, okay, so what happens when you say submit your manuscript? Okay, so your manuscript which you have submitted to some nature, it will land up on the editor's desk. As I said, there will be two possibilities behind that manuscript. One is that the manuscript is the result of a research work that followed ethical practices at every stage on the life cycle till then. Or this manuscript could be the result of an unethical research practice that was followed at any or some stage in a life cycle leading to the manuscript. So therefore, the editor of a journal needs to be conscious and also concerned about these two possibilities. So what is to be done? So there is hope in COPE. So what is this COPE? COPE is nothing but Committee on Publication Ethics. And this happens to be an international platform. Actually, it is a registered society in England. It's a platform for editors and publishers of peer-reviewed journals, providing the code of conduct, okay, and best practice guidelines which need to be followed in relation to publication ethics. So this COPE was actually constituted in the year 1997 or so. It was initially initiated by about 2 or 3 people, and they were actually editors of medical journals. See, this ethics problem largely started actually from the medical field, medical research actually. Basically because it involved a lot of trials with humans. So there were a lot of issues, ethical issues, which came up in that particular field. They still do, even to this day. So that was the reason a couple of people, they got together and decided that, look, we need to establish some code of conduct and have some guidelines, which can be termed as some best practice guidelines, which could be applied whenever a manuscript lands up on an editor's desk. So that was the beginning. It has come a long way since then. And a set of very detailed guidelines have been drawn up for editors of peer-reviewed journals, mainly to deal with publication misconduct. Again, here, a number of journals happen to have their own guidelines in dealing with publication misconduct. But by and large, many publishers and journals have actually accepted that the guidelines which have been drawn up by COPE are sort of a general guidelines which are applicable to journals in all research areas. And most of the journal editors and owners, they happen to be even members of this Committee on Publication Ethics. So it is now a cooperative effort of all these people which result in these guidelines. And of course, these guidelines evolve and over time and keep changing, adjusting themselves to the times. So they are more advisory in nature rather than prescriptive. And by and large, as I said, most of the journals and their editors have agreed to follow these guidelines. And not only guidelines, even this organization COPE, it even prescribes what are the actions one can take with respect to specific cases of publication misconduct. So they have simply, they need to refer to these action points or action guidelines and apply them in order to resolve issues. Similar to this Committee on Publication Ethics, there was another voluntary association called WAMI. So WAMI is actually, it's from WAME, is called World Association for Medical Editors, WAMI. And this is a non-profit voluntary association of editors of peer-reviewed medical journals. So this is specifically for medical research. And this voluntary association of editors for these medical journals, they got together from countries throughout the world. And they seek to foster international cooperation among, as well as education of medical journal editors. And what are the goals of this WAMI? To facilitate worldwide cooperation and communication among editors of peer-reviewed medical journals, to continuously improve editorial standards. You might feel that what is the problem with editorial standards? Like what you have cases of scientific misconduct and problems in the course of research work, there are also issues concerning editorial issues and editorial standards. So This kind of a cooperative effort is to improve editorial standards also. Then to promote professionalism in medical editing through education, then self-criticism and self-regulation. And they also would like to encourage research on the principles and practice of medical editing. So this was this WAMI, very specific to medical journals. Whereas the earlier one, COPE, encompasses almost all varieties of journals in different research areas. So now we come to the first topic under publication misconduct, which is called conflict of interest. So I'll be mostly following the COPE guidelines which have been issued in this regard, because now these COPE guidelines almost apply universally to all journals, and invariably all journals follow these guidelines whenever there are cases of publication misconduct which are noticed. So what is this conflict of interest? I had dealt with this topic in a brief manner during some of my earlier lectures, but now I would like to deal with this in detail. So conflict of interest. So there must be clear definitions of conflicts of interest and processes for handling conflict of interest of authors, reviewers, editors, journals, and publishers. So all these people, one needs to have proper guidelines on conflict of interest. And this conflict of interest, it could be identified before a publication or even after a paper has been published in the journal. So what are these conflict of interest situations? So these conflicts of interest situations are those which have the potential to influence people's judgments. So such situations may affect or may be perceived to affect. Okay? They can either affect or may be perceived to affect. Both are different. Every stage of research, from planning itself to applying for or allocating funding, conducting a study, interpreting the data, and reporting the research results. So specifically in publishing, these conflicts of interest, they can influence peer review processes, editorial decisions, and even the publication management. So it is very important that one needs to minimize the effect of conflicts of interest and thereby help maximize the objectivity and integrity of the research and scholarly literature. So we'll see how in various ways this conflict of interest manifests itself in the whole research and publication process. So this conflict of interest is a situation in which a person or the organization is involved in multiple interests, financial interests or otherwise, one of which could possibly corrupt the motivation of that individual or even the organization. So the presence of a conflict of interest is actually independent of the occurrence of the impropriety. So this competing interest, which is another name for conflict of interest, is anything that interferes with or could reasonably be perceived as interfering with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editorial decision making, or publication of research or non-research articles which are submitted to a journal. Okay. So basically this conflict of interest, it will actually interfere or maybe perceived to interfere with the way you present a manuscript, the way the manuscript is reviewed, the way the editor takes a decision on the manuscript, whether it is to be published, accepted for publication or not, and so and so. And now the reasons why this can happen is that they can be financial or non-financial. They can be professional or even personal. So these competing interests can arise in a relationship to an organization or another person. So when we proceed further in the lecture, it will become more and more clear how these competing interests can manifest themselves in various ways. One of the simplest way is that you happen to submit a manuscript, say on a study on some drug, and you state in your research work that your research results show that the drug is highly efficacious in treating certain disease, etc., in patients. Whereas behind all this, you may actually have a financial interest in the company that manufactures this drug. Maybe you have some shares in that company which manufactures this drug. So by pushing this drug in the form of a research result and publication, you give it a certain legitimacy. It may, in fact, it may work. The drug may work. I'm not saying the drug may not work. The drug may work also. But then because you happen to have an interest, a financial interest, if the drug becomes popular, and you are pushing the same drug in the form of a research result or a publication. So this is a clear conflict of interest, which is highly unethical. Okay. So that is, say, one example of what could be a conflict of interest. So the guidelines issued by COPE, they aim to minimize these effects of conflicts of interest, and thereby they can help maximize the objectivity and integrity of the research and scholarly literature. So what are the journals required to do in this regard? The journals need very clear, consistent, and well-publicized policies on conflicts of interest. And these journals should define in advance what needs to be disclosed by all parties, including the type of conflict of interest or competing interest, the extent of this competing interest involved, and the recency. That means how recent is this, the origin of this conflict of interest is. So in this whole process, the transparency is the key. If everyone is transparent right from the beginning, then things can go smoothly without any hitches and problems later also. So the relevant conflicts of interest can go beyond the funding source and commercial and or personal financial gain. And an acid test is that the conflict of interest is something that, if undeclared but discovered later, it would make a reasonable reader feel cheated. Okay? It will make a reasonable reader feel misled or deceived. So you read a particular article, for example, on this particular drug which I was talking about. So initially you may feel that, okay, fine. So this is a very good drug, and you may even, if you are a researcher, you may do some further work on that drug, or if you happen to be a member of the public who is affected by that disease for which the drug has been made, then after you come to know that there was a hidden interest behind the whole thing, it will leave a very bad taste in your mouth and you'll feel totally cheated about it. So how to avoid this kind of conflict of interest? The first step is that from the authors, there is an undertaking. So they use a standard form at the submission stage, manuscript submission stage itself, which increases the author disclosures to editors and inclusion of disclosures in the journal articles to inform the readers who subsequently read the manuscript if it is accepted. So these competing interests may arise in the conduct of research itself and in the context of publishing are thus not restricted to just the presentation, peer review, decision making, or publication of the articles in journal. So these journals must ensure that authors' conflicts of interest are disclosed to the editors and the readers. But of course, in all these situations, ultimately, the journals will have to rely on the author's honesty. So if you decide to be honest, everything is well and good. But right from the beginning, if you decide to be dishonest, then things may become, or they are bound to become messy at a later point in time. So now we'll see about how we have talked about conflict of interest from the author's point of view, where the authors have conflicts of interest while presenting their work. It is not restricted to authors, as I said earlier. It can happen with the editors also. So on the editorial board of all academic journals, the editors should also carry a conflict of interest statement that in fact reflects their past history as well as the actual relationships, the current relationships and positions that they have, as these may influence their editorial functions. See, most of the editors on scientific journals, they also happen to be scientists themselves. So they are also susceptible to equally to conflict of interest issues, very much like the authors themselves. And being on the editorial boards, they have even more power because editors, they form extensive networks either with other professionals, industries, academic bodies, other journals, or publishers. So such networks and relationships can actually influence their decisions or even their subjectivity towards a set of submitting authors or a paper or even the institute. And this could ultimately influence the peer review process itself. So this is like the editor himself. See, if you have a big complex, say like BRC, you appoint people to take care of the security, the watchmen. Okay. So the watchmen or the security, they take care that no one creates any issue, a security issue with the institute. But if the security itself gets compromised, what do? The situation is similar here. So here the editor is like the security watchman. So who will police the security? Who will police the watchman? Who will watch the watchman himself? Okay. So this is the situation which can come up where the editors can also have their own conflict of interest. Then the other entity are the reviewers. Whenever a manuscript is submitted to a journal, the editor, after due initial processing, will take a decision whether the particular manuscript is fit to be considered for that particular journal. And if it is fit, then he has to get that manuscript reviewed independently by certain experts in the field who are called reviewers. Now, these people also happen to be scientists because you're dealing with a scientific publication, and to say whether that particular scientific publication has merit or not, the person needs to know a bit of that science. So he has to be a scientist himself. So reviewers also are scientists. So they also must disclose their own conflict of interest before they even take up a manuscript for review, and also during the review process itself. Okay. So they must disclose their interests, because otherwise it may prevent an impartial review, including recent collaborations with that particular author who was submitted, or being at the same institution as the author. So again, for the reviewers, the competing interests could be personal, they could be financial, they could be intellectual, professional, political, or even sometimes religious in nature. Anything can happen. So, for example, if the review is currently employed at the same institution as any of the authors of that submitted manuscript, or has been a recent mentor during the last 3 years, or a mentee, or a close collaborator, or even a joint grant holder with that particular author or set of authors, he should not in principle actually agree to review the manuscript. He should refuse to review the manuscript, mentioning that he has a conflict of interest with that particular author or that institution from which the author belongs to. So we'll see for the first example in this regard, the case history of a reviewer. Again, I have taken all these case histories and examples from the COPE website. So they are all belong to the COPE guidelines. So if you people are also interested, you can actually go to this website, which is, I think it is called, sorry. www.publication ethics dot I think it is com or probably org. So publicationethics.org. So that is the concerned website for the scope, and you'll find all this plenty of case histories on this website, and there are many other websites also like Retraction Watch, which have a record of all these cases. So the first case I deal with is actually a paper which was received by some journal A at some point of time, and it was sent to a certain Dr. X for comments or review. And this Dr. S, actually he advises that the paper was not original in light of a publication by his own research group earlier in the year in another journal. And that furthermore, this study contained over twice as many patients as the paper the journal had sent to him to referee. So on basis of this negative review, the journal decided to reject the paper on the strength of this Dr. S's report. But what happens later? 2 months later, Dr. X submitted a paper to the same journal A on exactly the same research topic based on a combination of patient data from several research centers, but giving a much larger sample size than either of the aforementioned. And the journal decided to reject the paper as it did not add enough to the previously published research. Why? Because the journal editors thought that Dr. X had a competing interest. Okay, the Dr. X actually had a competing interest, and that the authors of the paper submitted in August earlier might have had cause for complaint had they known the referee was about to submit a related article to the same journal. So the referee did not mention at the time when he accepted to review the paper that he was also intending to submit a manuscript which was very similar in the same area of research to the same journal. Okay. So the journal requires referees to declare potential conflict of interest and ask the referees to consider declaring other competing interests, although this is voluntary. And this particular Dr. X, who was the referee, did not mention at that time he was referring for the journal that he was planning to submit a very closely related competing article. So how should this be taken further? Okay. So the result is that the referee should have declared his or her conflict of interest and declined to referee the paper. So the editor should reconsider the paper, informing the authors that the referee had behaved badly by not stating his or her competing interests. So that applies a kind of closure to that particular case. Now this is another case history which involves again a reviewer who is also an author. So here there's one Dr. B who accepted an invitation to review a manuscript for a journal A. Okay. Now this Dr. B was aware only of the title of the manuscript and had read the abstract before accepting the invitation. And he was also aware that he was to return his review within a time limit of 2 weeks. Okay. So when he decided to accept the manuscript, what were the things known to him? He was not even told about the names of the authors. He knew what was the title of the manuscript. He also knew what is the abstract of the manuscript. On basis of these two, he accepted to review the manuscript, and he also accepted that he will return he will submit his review within a period of 2 weeks. So 2 weeks elapsed, and the review failed to materialize within that time. So then the editorial office of Journal A sent the reviewer 4 email reminders for the course of next 1 month. These days, even that much time also is not given. They send a referee, this Dr. B, 4 email reminders. Now what happened? Without even replying to any of these reminders, this Dr. B, you can see I have made this bold, he submitted his own manuscript to the same journal for consideration. Now, when the editorial office confirmed the acceptance of this manuscript, that means they have accepted the manuscript of the referee. They also reminded him that they had yet to receive his original review, but this man did not respond at all. So what is the story behind this? And this happens very, very often, especially I will tell you, it happens very often to Indian authors. So when Dr. B's own paper was looked at, it became clear that there was a significant degree overlap in the content of his paper and the one he was supposed to be refereeing or reviewing. So while the editors did not feel that Dr. B had plagiarized the review manuscript, see, the referee was very smart. He did not plagiarize anything. Okay? While he did not plagiarize, they were concerned, the editors were concerned that he had actually acted unethical. Why? Because he had accepted an invitation to review a manuscript that was very similar to the research that his own laboratory was conducting and planning to submit the same journal. Okay. So although this scenario is not explicitly addressed in the journal's instructions to reviewers, it is the journal's expectation that professionals in this situation will decline the invitation to review in order to avoid a conflict of interest. But this referee did not do that. He very smartly kept the manuscript in his table or in his desk, waited till he or his own group submitted the manuscript, probably in the same area of research, in competing mode. And after his paper was accepted, probably he started looking at it. Okay. So this is a very unethical way of doing a review. Just because you find that a particular manuscript which has come to you for referring happens to be in your own area of research, and probably if that gets published, probably that work was good enough. And if it gets published before your work gets published, so you will become an also ran rather than the original author himself. So this is a highly unethical conduct on part of the referee. Now this is another case history concerning now an editor of a journal. Now there is one journal which specializes in one form of treatment. So this is a highly focused journal, probably very, very narrow field of research. So it must be also having a very limited audience also. So it is the only Medline listed journal in that area. It is widely accessed in Europe by people who use this particular form of treatment. No international journals provide a suitable alternative. Probably in USA, the one journal which is most similar to this particular one is much less specialized, and probably no one in Europe even looks at it. Now the editor of this journal, it happens to be a leading scientist, a researcher, this form of treatment. So because he's an editor of this journal, he has a very clear conflict of interest when he himself wants to submit a research article. And the problem now is that he will have to submit his own research work in the same journal, because that area of research is so narrow that there's only one journal which is catering to that particular area of research. So if the editor himself happens to be a scientist and a researcher and wants to submit his work, he will have to submit in the same journal. But he will face a conflict of interest. Okay. It's like that old poem in, there was an old novel or book called Alice in Wonderland, written by Lewis Carroll. So there's a poem which says, I'll be the judge and I'll be the jury and I'll condemn you to death. So it is like this. So he is the judge and he's also the jury. Okay. So how he will be accepting his own paper and how he will get the refereeing done. So, but he was a very conscientious person. So he wants to establish a means of dealing with this conflict of interest, and he approached the journal owners and co to advise him in this regard. So now the journal's current peer review policy for this type of an article is to have two reviewers, and at least one of them happens to be an external reviewer. So it would be clearly possible to change this to two external reviewers for articles from people who belong to the editorial board. So, but there could be even a conflict of interest even in choice of external reviewers. So what is the issue here? It basically revolves around whether it is acceptable for editors to publish their own work in their journals. If it is, then the review process must be made as transparent and rigorous as possible. And maybe when they actually, if they decide to accept and publish that particular manuscript, they may even put a note saying that this person happens to be also the editor of the journal or is on the editorial board, but such and such review process was followed in this particular case. So provided every effort is made to minimize any bias in the review process by having another associate editor handle the peer review procedure independently of this editor, and because it also recognizes that it will be impossible to remove this bias completely, and the process is made completely transparent. So this would be the most appropriate route to take. Okay. Now another case here is that an associate editor received a letter claiming harassment from an author from another country by the editor. So an associate editor who is below the editor, he receives a letter from some author saying that the editor of the journal is harassing. So what is harassment? The author submitted a manuscript which was repeatedly sent back for changes in format, but not rejected. And eventually the author withdrew the article and submitted to another international peer-reviewed journal with a good impact factor, where it was accepted immediately with high priority. Okay, so he informed the editor and the associate editor of the irregularity and that he suspects some foul play. So the associate editor informed the editor that there was indeed a conflict of interest. Why? Because another similar manuscript from another author who was very close to the editor was under review process in the same journal. And in fact, this associate editor was verbally asked to stay away from the matter. So the editor refused to discuss the matter in the editorial board meetings and also threatened to have the associate editor sacked. So does this constitute an editor misconduct? And if so, what should be the course of action? So is there any ethical binding on the associate editor to have the matter investigated further? So the committee agreed that the associate editor did have an ethical responsibility to take action, but to take the pressure off this associate editor, it was suggested that any member of the editorial board would raise the issue and press for a discussion in the editorial meeting, because the editorial board has an obligation to ask the editor-in-chief for an explanation of his actions. And if there is no satisfactory explanation, next step would be contact the society committee or the owners, and then the associate editor could ask them to investigate the matter. Okay. So ultimately, either the editor-in-chief is sacked, or they may even formulate very specific policy where the conflict of interest involving the editor will be avoided in future. Now, so far what I have spoken about are declared conflict of interest. Okay, because what happens is that competing interest or conflict of interest comes to light after the publication, because of which editors have been very unwilling or uncertain of the process to issue a correction. So if during the peer review, the reviewers suspect undeclared author conflicts of interest, they need to inform the editor, who in turn will follow the relevant flowchart before continuing with the review. That is the first case, where an assumed conflict of interest was detected at the time of peer review. Now, suppose the paper has been already accepted and published, and the reader group which reads the paper, they report some possible undisclosed author conflicts of interest, then what should the journal do? There also it should follow a certain procedure and issue a correction if appropriate, or even retract this manuscript or paper. So how will this actually follow? I mean, Prof has issued flowcharts for both these cases. So let's see the submission stage. If the problem occurs, at the review stage itself, what should be the flowchart of the to be followed by the editor. So what happens here? The first case, the 1 second, please. Pointer options. Yeah. So here the reviewer informs the editor or the author's undisclosed conflict of interest. He suspects something, okay? So he informs the editor. So what should the editor do? He thanks the reviewer and says that he will plan to investigate. Then he starts the action. What does he do? He contacts the authors and expresses concern that there is a possibility of conflict of interest. And also in that same thing, he will also provide him with a copy of the journal's policy concerning conflict of interest. Now, there are two possibilities. The author replies with certain details, or the author denies that there is a conflict of interest. Now, suppose the author replies saying that yes, there is a conflict of interest and supplies some relevant details. Then what should the editor do? Depending on what he has actually supplied the information, he will of course thank the author for giving the information, but then he may point out the seriousness of the omission of this conflict of interest, and then he may ask him to amend the conflict of interest statement as required, and then proceed with the review. And then of course inform the reviewer of the action which he has taken. But now suppose the author denies the conflict of interest, then of course the editor has to explain the journal policy regarding conflict of interest clearly, and he must obtain a signed statement from the author about all the relevant conflict of interest issues. So once that is obtained, once the author has signed that statement, he is now bound by that statement, then it will proceed for review and go ahead. So this will be the flowchart of action for the case of a manuscript that has been submitted for peer review and detected at the peer review stage. Okay. Now suppose this has not been detected, and it so happens that after publication of this manuscript, some conflict of interest has been detected by somebody and the editor has been informed. So here what happens? Some reader, he informs the editor of this author's undisclosed conflict of interest. So then again, the editor will have to thank that particular reader, and now he has to inform him that he will investigate. So he will start the investigation in the same way. He will also again ask the author to explain. And again, you have two cases where the author says, yes, there is certain conflict of interest or whatever. Then again, he has to inform him about the policies, and then he also has to tell him about the article, which is sorry, I can't read this properly. He has to reassess the article, which is based on this undisclosed conflict of interest. Then again, he has to consider whether this conflict of interest unduly affected the article or the peer review, because this article has been already published, okay? The peer review is already done. So he has to decide whether this particular conflict of interest actually affected the peer review process. So if it has actually affected the peer review process, then of course, he has to consider post-publication some changes which are as appropriate, as deemed appropriate, and he may consider also informing the relevant author institutions. And then there could be two ways of dealing with it. Either you publish a retraction of that paper, or you publish a correction to the competing interest statement. Okay? Or if it has not affected the peer review process, you simply publish a correction to the competing interest statement, informing the reader of the outcome, and then again proceed in the same way. Now again, in the case where the author has denied any conflict of interest, then again he has to take some action. He has to consider whether this conflict of interest exists at the author's institution, and then again, if it is found, then go back to this point again and go through the same process. Or if there is no conflict of interest found, the publication will remain as it is, and there is no action taken on as far as the publication is concerned, but also the author is also informed that this is the action taken. So this is a more drawn-out process as compared to the earlier one. So I think we come to the end of this session, and So now let me see if there are any questions from your side. Let us see. Other one. How is it possible for the reader to identify conflict of interest? Yes, it's a good question. See, when you are in a certain field of research, see what can happen is that, and you of course, when you are doing a particular research, you know which journals you should look at, or which is your area of research journals, etc. So when you keep going through, you might find a paper which could be very similar to what you have been working on. And probably, I mean, this is just getting a thought experiment, okay, and possibility. And you may feel that, you may remember that a few days ago that there was some researcher who had come to your lab from some other laboratory and spent a considerable amount of time there, and he probably talked to you or your supervisor about the research which you are doing, and there could be certain vital things which you might have learned, and then after going back, before probably you could publish your work, he has already published it. So when you read that particular paper, you will realize that this particular person had visited your lab. He has already discussed with you about the research work which you have been doing, and you know for sure that it is clearly your own research problem which he has actually scooped and then published it himself. So this is one example where the reader comes to know that there has been a conflict of interest. Of course, this is like something like plagiarism. But of course, this is also the reader should have talked about it. Okay, the author should have if he's an ethical person, he should not have done it. Then other possibilities are like the drug example which I talked to you. Suppose you are already aware that that particular author is on the board of directors of a company which makes the same drug. You are already aware about it. And that has not come out in the paper. That conflict of interest has not been declared. But you happen to know that person actually has a dual interest. So that also, this way also you can come to know that. So it's basically by pure chance that the reader comes to know about a possible conflict of interest in this regard. And very often, as I said, it happens to be a person who is closely related in that area of research work. He knows who are the other people working in that area of research, and he knows what all is possible, etc., and all those things. So this is one such way of the reader who is able to identify a conflict of interest. Yeah, any more questions? Not in this chat box. What about the other chat box? Any other questions in the other chat box? No. Okay, so there are no more questions. And again, I can inform you that in case you have any particular questions to ask, you can always write to me by email also, and I will try to explain it in the next lecture. So thank you very much.